Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and expanding the Sangha, our experience of Sangha, and thank you to the Sangha online for also joining us. So this is a Sunday talk on June 30th, 2024. Is this a good day or a bad day? I want to talk about good and bad, and also about what awakening is like. There's a question that's come up this week at the monastery. What is awakening like? People read experiences of awakening and then say, oh, that's the one I want. But that actually prevents it from happening. So we have a chant called the Xinxing Ming, affirming faith in mind, composed, maybe, by Kanshi Sosan Zenji, Qianqi Sing Qian San, in Chinese, who lived in the 500s, and is said to be one of the 7 successors of Huiko, the second ancestor after Bodhidharma. This chant admonishes us over and over and over again not to fall into judging good and bad. For example, the Great Way is not difficult. This is how it begins. For those who do not pick and choose. When preferences are cast aside, the way stands clear and undisguised. But don't we all have preferences? Aren't we all picking and choosing? We choose to get up when the alarm clock rings or the bell rings or not. Now hit the snooze button. We choose what we want to eat. We choose what clothes we want to wear. So what does this mean? The Great Way is not difficult for those who do not pick and choose. When preferences are cast aside, the way stands clear and undisguised. And if you want to see the truth, discard opinions pro and con. Whoa, that's not easy. The way is perfect like vast space. Our choice to choose and to reject prevents our seeing this. Simple truth. And it says, if there's a trace of right and wrong, true mind is lost. If there's a trace of right and wrong, true mind is lost. What is it talking about? During the Silent Illumination retreat a few weeks ago, Chan teacher Rebecca Lee picked this chant for us to chant every day. And she exhibited something about what it talks about when she kept saying, if your mind wanders, not a problem. But isn't that exactly what we see as the big problem when we meditate? So how could somebody say, not a problem? So some teachers say, this is exactly meditation. Detecting when your mind has wandered and bringing it back. Over and over and over again. Until the mind becomes convinced that happiness lies in thinking only when it's necessary to think. And not thinking the rest of the time. This is a tall order. This is not come to one session and get awakened. This happens when being vividly present with a mind that's quiet is both restful and delightful. When being present in a quiet mind is both restful and delightful. This happens when being present is our natural mind. This week at breakfast I mentioned something that Thich Nhat Hanh said, which is relevant. He said, I think, therefore I am not present. John Kabat-Zinn talked over and over about being present, showing up for our life, daring to show up for our life, exactly as it is. So why do we keep judging good and bad? Was the election debate on Thursday good or bad? It certainly distressed many people who felt that it went badly. And it made other people gleeful who felt that it went very well for their side. Good or bad? When will we know? Will we know in November? Will we know in 4 years? Will we know in 100 years whether it was good or bad? Once when Maizumi Roshi heard us arguing about some political situation, and somebody asked his opinion, he asked us a question, which I'd like you to ponder. Was World War II good or bad? World War II was the deadliest military conflict in human history. An estimated total of 70 to 85 million people perished, civilians and combatants, or about 3% of the estimated global population. 3% of the people on Earth died. In Russia, it was 24 million. In Japan, it was 3 million. In the US, it was 500,000, which would be the entire population of Portland being wiped out. The 2 atomic bombings alone killed 1/3 of the people. 1/3 of the people in the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And this question, was World War II good or bad, came from a man who had lived through World War II in Japan. And this question has stuck in my mind ever after. I ask that question or something similar to it when I discover my mind is doing good and bad, good and bad. Good or bad? It was bad for all the people who died in concentration camps and bombing and fighting, and for their families. It was very difficult. Long, long-lasting traumatic effects. It was good for the people released from concentration camps before they had died. It was good for our education about what human beings are capable of doing when their minds lead them astray. The horrors of World War II brought about the League of Nations, the UN, NATO, nuclear arms treaties, and the Marshall Plan, which provided funds from the US to rebuild not only the destruction that occurred to our allies, but also our former enemies in Europe and Asia. And it created the State of Israel, carved out of territory previously called Canaan, Palestine, and the Holy Land. The Israeli settlers, escaping many, many centuries of persecution, not just the Holocaust, established kibbutz, gardens, bringing an abundance of food and eventually a very prosperous country out of the desert. The nation of Israel declared its establishment formally on the 14th of May, 1948. The very next day, armies from neighboring Arab states invaded, starting the first Arab-Israeli war. And there have been several Arab-Israeli wars since then. I was in Israel, visiting kibbutz, and saw this prosperous, happy country. Especially happy when I visited some days after the 3-day war ended, the third Arab-Israeli war. And Israelis were jubilant, singing Yerushalayim Shel Zahav in the streets, Jerusalem of gold. But we're feeling the repercussions of all of that now. Karma continues. Karma continues. Good, bad, good, bad, good, bad. Karma continues. Or, as it's called in the Chant tradition, causes and conditions. Was World War II and this attempt at retribution, this attempt at restoring, good or bad? This was a story that Maizumi Roshi also told us several times. It's from a Chinese tale, quite famous. There are versions by Alan Watts and Eckhart Tolle. I'll give you both of those. Once upon a time, there was a Chinese farmer who had a horse, and the horse ran away. And all the neighbors came around that evening and said, "Your precious horse is gone. Too bad, you're so unfortunate." And the farmer said, "Maybe." But the next day, the horse came back and brought 7 wild horses with it. And then all the neighbors came around and said, "Oh my gosh, now you have a whole herd of horses. You are so fortunate." And he said, "Maybe." But then one day, his son, who was attempting to break in one of the horses, was thrown off and broke his leg. And then all the neighbors came around and said, "What a bad turn of events. You're so unfortunate." And he said, "Maybe." The next day, the conscription officers came from the army, looking to put all the young men into the army to fight a war. But they rejected his son because he had a broken leg. And all the neighbors came around that evening and said, "Isn't that wonderful? Your son doesn't have to fight in the war." And the farmer said, "Maybe." So here's Eckhart Tolle's modern version. There once was a wise man who won an expensive car in a lottery. His family and friends were very happy for him and came to celebrate. "Isn't it great?" they said. "You're so lucky." The man smiled and said, "Maybe." For a few weeks, he enjoyed driving the car. Then one day, a drunken driver crashed into his new car at an intersection, and he ended up in the hospital with multiple injuries. His family and friends came to see him and said, "That was really unfortunate." And the man smiled and said, "Maybe." While he was still in the hospital, one night there was a landslide and his house in California fell into the sea. Again, his friends came the next day and said, "Weren't you lucky? That's so unfortunate. You were so lucky to be here in the hospital." And he said, "Maybe." So I'm interested in whether people have had experiences in their life that at the time they thought were good, that at the time they thought were bad, and turned out to be good, or vice versa. But usually it's, we think things are going really well, and they turn bad. But more often it's, we think things are really bad. It's this terrible tragedy in our life. How will we get over it? Trauma for the rest of our life, etc. Things that happened in your life that seemed very bad at the time. And then you realized, years later, maybe decades later, oh, that was actually good. Anybody got any examples?
When I was in college age, I was trying to figure out how would pay for college. And I come from a military family. My father was in the Air Force, and my grandfathers were in the Army in World War II, and even back to the U.S. Civil War. So I thought this would be my path. So I applied to be part of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. And I was an athlete in high school and passed all the tests except for then there was the physical test where you do a bunch of things. You run wind sprints and throw a basketball and do all these physical things. They just see if you're capable of moving around. And during the course of it, I couldn't do it. I couldn't run. I was slower than everyone. And by the end of it, as my dad was as we were going out, I threw up in the bushes. And I ended up having a severe case of stomach flu. And so they failed me and didn't accept me. And so I thought this was a horrible thing. How am I gonna pay for college? But it ended up being a great blessing because I ended up not having to serve 5 or 6 years in the military right after college, and was able to start the career that ended up being my life's work because of that. So life would have been fine otherwise too, but I wouldn't trade that path, and it was a great. I don't know what my life would be like had I ended up serving. I might have been in a war. I might have ended up being killed in a war. But because of that, my life turned out the way that it was. So it was a great blessing to be horrendously sick and to be a complete failure athletically.
Even though you're an athlete, that's really humiliating. So humiliation turns into good fortune. Anybody else? Any examples of something at the time you thought, oh, this is terrible, and then it put you on a different path? Turned out to be fortunate.
So while people are thinking, say something while people are thinking. Oh, Chozen and I and the Zen student community of Oregon used to have a place out in the gorge. We were there for 10 years. It was 14 acres, beautiful, looked down the gorge, gorgeous, and we ran into zoning problems and had to leave. And we were really crushed. We put 10 years of life and money and Sangha juice into it, and the whole thing collapsed. And because of that, we have great vow. So that collapse opened the door for this. Who else?
Hi, do I tell my name? I'm Cecily. I'm visiting. Thank you for letting me be here. 40 years ago, I was living on welfare and lived with the father of my 40-year-old daughter. And we were basically homeless, except for that I was so pregnant. This woman who was racially hated my guts let us move into her home and pay the rent. But it turns out that the father of my daughter was not paying the rent. And long story short, she kicked him out, which was the best blessing that I ever had. So I hated being there, hated living on welfare, hated being abused by this man, who then she kicked out, so I wasn't abused by him anymore. And I was able to escape before he killed us and live a better life. Well, that's the shortest I've ever told that story.
Thank you. Thank you. Actually, that's very similar. We celebrated Joko Beck, Zen teacher Joko Beck's death day a few weeks ago. And she was married to a college professor. And he was very abusive, but nobody knew that. They admired him. And one day he tied her up and he was going to kill her. He was ready to kill her with a knife. And a neighbor walked in and saved her life. And so she left him. And even though everybody believed that he couldn't have done this, she left, and with her 4 children, and became the secretary of the chemistry department at UC San Diego. Those of you who worked in academia know that the secretaries run the whole department. So she knew everybody, And she, through a series of, quote, coincidences, met Maizumi Roshi and was intrigued and began practicing Zen. And then she started a little sitting group. And a lot of people from the university, including my first husband, started practicing Zen. And I was so intrigued at the changes in him that I began practicing Zen. So if it hadn't been for the fact that her husband tried to kill her, a neighbor walked in, she left him, she became, etc., I wouldn't be here teaching Zen. So I won't ask you to think of more, but there's lots, actually. Lots. Yeah. Everyone has that kind of story, if you've lived long enough. You know, it takes some time to see karma unfold, right? From something that you thought was difficult. So Alan Watts said about the farm story, the farmer's story, this reflects a fundamentally Taoistic attitude, which is that the whole process of nature is an integrated process of immense complexity. It is really impossible to tell whether anything that happens in it is good or bad, because you never know what will be the consequences of a misfortune, or you never know what will be the consequences of good fortune. You never know the chain, the pattern, the connection between events. So we also have to not mind dying. Right? A lot of people died in all these world wars and are dying now. So we have to step back from our individual difficulties, and if we live long enough, we'll watch some of them end up being very beneficial to us and to others. But to step back and know that we don't know the consequences of fortune or good fortune. For example, if you read the stories of people who win the lottery, it's not a life of happiness after you win the lottery. People descend upon you, claiming that they're relatives or that you owe them money, and it's really, really difficult. And then your heirs, start fighting over the money, and then the money disappears very quickly because people cheat you. It turns out if you won the lottery and it raises the level of your life so that you have food, shelter, medicine, the basics, then you're happy. But if you try to go beyond that, it can be a disaster. So everything is interconnected, and we can't possibly see all the prior causes or predict the future consequences. So one conclusion is, instead of judging something as good or bad, accept it just as it is, without adding good or bad. Doesn't mean we don't grieve when somebody dies. Accepting it does not mean not acting. So what about awakening? This was a question that came up this week during some of our conversations over lunch. What is awakening? What is the state of mind described in affirming faith and mind, in that chant that we chant, and many other chants that we chant, like Silent Illumination and Hall of Pure Bliss? What is that state of mind that is calling us? And we're all here, everyone here and everyone online today, in person and online, because we feel that awakening will help. It will help us see beyond good and bad and help us find our place to heal the human world. How to attain it, that's the question. How do I get it? The question actually is how to uncover it, how to reveal it. It's not something to be attained like victory after a long battle. It is already and everywhere present. How to experience it then, we might ask. Well, we all have, in small ways, like in what we call peak moments. Peak moments when we're running, or we're seeing something beautiful, or a birth, or something extraordinary, when the mind stops and we're just totally present. That gives us a taste of what awakening is like. Or when someone dies and we're just there with this dead body and the people who are coming to help. And it's fundamentally okay. So this is already and everywhere present. And how can we experience it? By getting out of the way. And one of the best ways to get out of the way is by meditating. By walking the meditation path over and over and over again, sesshin after sesshin, retreat after retreat, morning sitting after morning sitting, from anxious, tangled skein mind, caught in a tangle of what shall I do about this, what shall I do about that, how can I fix that person, from walking from anxious, tangled mind to simplified mind, to one-pointed mind, to big mind, to natural mind. And, we do that in various ways. Besides retreats, we do the work of Byron Katie, for example. There are other ways to do this work. So I'm going to do a process here that was invented by one of my Dharma brothers, who was always looking for shortcuts. So you can see if this is a shortcut to awakening. We all want shortcuts, right? Let's see. Even Harada Roshi, one of our teachers in Japan, when he first went to the monastery, he thought, okay, I'll do Rohatsu Sesshin, a 10-day sesshin, celebrating the Buddha's enlightenment, and then I'll get enlightened, and then everything will be fine. What didn't happen, he was very disappointed. So we all want it to happen now. It is happening now, but we're just not aware of it. So this is a process that one of my Dharma brothers invented. So it's based in voice dialogue. Some of you have done voice dialogue. It's based in all of the voices within us. So one voice that he described as within us is the controller. So if you just close your eyes and try to access the controller aspect of your mind and functioning within you. So ask the question, what is the controller controlling right now in me? Notice your posture. Is the controller controlling your posture or admonishing you about your posture? Is it controlling your breathing rate? Whether you breathe slowly or faster, deeply or shallowly. Is it controlling what you might answer if I ask a question? Is it controlling whether you're smiling or you have a very serious meditation face? So we have to ask the controller, would you be willing to move out of the way for just a few minutes? You're doing an excellent job controlling this person and what they do, how they walk, what they say, how they think. You're doing an excellent job, but we'd like you just to step aside and observe for a while. Would that be okay? So you have to ask your controller part, would that be okay if it steps aside and just observes for a while? And it can come back anytime if it gets worried. So ask that question of your controller. Is it willing to step aside so you can access another voice? Just for a little while. And it can continue to monitor and step in if it feels worried. But is it willing to step aside just to try this, to step aside, just for a few minutes? Okay, hopefully it said yes. It's willing to try this experiment. So now we'd like to access big mind. So just search around within your experience and access big mind. The voice of big mind. Now from within big mind, when did big mind begin? Anyone, if there's a response. From within big mind, when did big mind begin? Anyone? Now, timeless.
What is big mind?
What is big mind? Anyone else? From within big mind, when did big mind begin? When we're born? An explosion.
No beginning.
No beginning. Any other observations? These are direct observations. When you really look from within big mind, when did it begin? You can ask it, when did you begin? There's no right or wrong answer here. It's just your experience from within big mind. But
The moment you suggested it.
the moment I suggested it. Ah. So from within big mind, how big is big mind? Ask it how big it is. Or experience how big it is. How big is it? Anyone?
Immeasurable.
Immeasurable?
It's here.
It's here.
As big as it is.
As big as it is. No walls. Gets bigger with interconnectivity. So from within big mind, we could say dwelling in the land, the experience of big mind, how do you see time? From within big mind, how do you see time? Anyone?
There's only ever now.
It's only ever now.
It's a convenient and relevant tool for non-big mind things.
It's a convenient and relevant tool for non-big mind things to happen, huh? Pretty spacious stage for all of those events. Mm-hmm. And some of those events include elections. So you can watch that from within big mind. Wars. Marriages, death, birth, trees being cut down, furniture being made out of that wood, an earth that's heating up. So all of these things we can see in a different way from within big mind. So what can we do when horrific or even frightening events occur, which happens all the time? There are 10 wars going on around the world right now, in which are killing more than 100,000 people in each of these countries every year. What can we do when we become frightened by what's happening in the world? What we have chosen to do and can do is to practice to empty our conditioned, innately prejudiced heart-mind, expand our narrow, self-centered heart-mind, and thereby create the conditions for awakening. What we don't want to do when horrifying or frightening events occur is to create mini-wars in our family or our Sangha or our nation. That's exactly how big wars start. We want to awaken, to have continued access to that awakened mind and to be able to function from it as much as possible, and to be inspired by people who seem to be functioning from it a lot of the time, like the Dalai Lama and other people you might admire. Mm-hmm. The Dalai Lama says, have patience with complexity. This is not an easy practice, but the most important practice. Have patience with complexity. We want to simplify and take sides. Mm-hmm. Have patience with complexity. Karma is extremely complex. And then he says, if you can't do anything about it, let it go. If you can do something about it, then do it. Continue to do good where you are planted, and to follow the precepts. Ajahn Amaro once said, the precepts are like a user's manual for a human life. He said, we buy a car, we get a user's manual, and when things go off, we can consult it. Well, that's how the precepts function for a human life. We're not given very good manuals. Whatever our parents cobble together, that's what they give us as a user's manual. Sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. But the precepts give us a well worked out manual for living a human life. And they're the same in most religions. So that's also passes the test of time and different traditions, different places people live and circumstances they live in, to do good. To do good. And to not allow the three poisons to poison you, us, our minds, our hearts, and the people around us. So people often ask, when events are not within my ability to change, which is what, 99.9% of events? Then I do what I can for those who are suffering. Arguing only makes me and others suffer. Inaction in the face of injustice makes me suffer, which means there's more suffering in the world. My parents, who were pacifists and activists, taught me this. When you feel like you can't do something, there is actually something you can do. So at ZCLA, when my father was visiting once, somebody asked him, there's so much need in the world. How do you decide who or where to help? And my father said, what's right in front of you? So I'll give examples. This is not to brag about what I do, but just examples as things were right in front of me, what I have done. I've contributed to Islamic relief, beginning during the Afghan war. Last week I bought first aid kits for emergency responders in Ukraine through an organization called White Stork. Because when they're responding on the battlefield, often people are bleeding to death, and these specialized first aid kits help them stop the bleeding with tourniquets and special bandages. I've helped a Sangha member sponsor 2 families who are fleeing persecution in Venezuela and are now living in Portland and applying for asylum. A number of us in our Sangha have done that. In the past, after the Afghan war, quote, ended, I contributed winter clothing for Afghan refugees who were evacuated to an army base in the U.S. during the winter. As the U.S. withdrew, I've written letters to Congress about gun control. From my own perspective, we shouldn't have our children frightened. We shouldn't be frightened when our children go to school, to a concert, to the post office, to church, that they're going to be killed. In the past, I joined civil rights marches in the South. I also marched against the Vietnam War, donated to SIVA for surgery to correct blindness from cataracts in India and to Doctors Without Borders. And then I gave money to my grandchildren for Christmas in a strange way, which was, I said, I will give you $35 to $50, and you have to donate that to charity. And then I gave them several charities that they could consider. One was for volleyball uniforms and soccer uniforms for kids in Africa, and they play sports, so that's relevant to them. One was SIVA, which helps correct blindness among children and people who can't access surgery for cataracts. And one was the heifer program. There's several like that, where you can buy a flock of chickens and then a family can sell the eggs and become independent and so on. So there's lots of really good organizations, and I check them out, how much money is spent on administration and how much actually ends up going to the people. But I was taught early in life to give, because we tithed in church. We gave 1/10 of our family's income. And I would get, when I was little, like 5 cents to donate, which was my whole half of my allowance. So I realized that we have to be taught to be generous. So that's what I was trying to teach them. And I vote every year. And I pray for all the victims of the current wars in this world. So please, if you have an aspiration to awaken further than you already are awakened, to extend that experience of what is already your original mind, your innate Buddha nature, please keep practicing and follow the precepts. Thank you.